With my writings, I have arrived century too early. Only in 100 years will my work be taken seriously, and then people will return to study and recognize the value of my books. Kant was right when his greatest work, Critique of Pure Reason, was published in 1781. Many criticized this text, which today is considered one of the most important works in the history of philosophy, and others would continue to criticize it even later.
Kant risks destroying the entire metaphysical tradition. His critique does not build. It annihilates what reason has painstakingly constructed over the centuries.
The reason Kant claims to defend is a soulless machine. He forgets that thought is born from language, from history, from human flesh. Without these, it is nothing but an abstract ghost.
How can Kant say that we do not know the thing in itself and then assign it the power to cause phenomena? That is a blatant contradiction at the very heart of his system.
Kant opened the path but stopped halfway. His philosophy is still trapped in a dualism that must be overcome. True freedom of spirit requires a deeper and more unified foundation.
Kantian philosophy is a labyrinth of abstractions incapable of grasping the concrete. Reason cannot remain confined within the limits Kant imposes. It is historical, dialectical, alive.
Kant is the greatest of all philosophers, but also the most obscure. His critique is a work of genius stifled by barbaric language, scholastic style, and a mountain of avoidable errors.
These are just some of the many remarks that have been made about this work. It is still widely studied today, because it remains deeply obscure and yet indispensable, filled with fundamental philosophical problems. In this video, we will attempt to present the essential points that define this work, highlighting the key pillars of the Kantian thought. Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, like his other major works, is written in the form of a systematic treatise. This is not just a traditional choice, but reflects Kant's belief that philosophy needs to be organized and methodical. For Kant, systematic unity is what turns ordinary knowledge into science. Therefore, the Critique is a foundational work for a future complete system of philosophy, where knowledge is divided into two main areas: theoretical knowledge about nature and practical knowledge about freedom. The book is divided into two main parts: Doctrine of Elements, which breaks down reason into its basic components, and Doctrine of Method, which explains how these components are used, although this method is also partially explained in the first part. The Doctrine of Elements is split further into two parts: Transcendental Aesthetic, which deals with how we sense things, and Transcendental Logic, which deals with how we think things. The Transcendental Logic is also divided into two parts: the Transcendental Analytic, which focuses on understanding, and Transcendental Dialectic, which focuses on the reason in its narrow sense. Transcendental for Kant doesn't mean above senses, but how our mental abilities, senses, understanding, and reason, make knowledge possible. The Transcendental Aesthetic in Kant's philosophy deals with the a priori forms of sensibility, which is our ability to be affected by external objects. According to Kant, all knowledge begins with experience, meaning it starts when our senses are influenced by things outside us. This happens through what he calls intuition, which is a direct, not logical kind of perception. While experience gives us the content of knowledge, what we sense, the form, how we are able to receive and organize that content, is given a priori, meaning it exists in the mind before any experience. So every intuition has two parts: the material part, the actual sensation, and the formal part, the mental structure that makes sensation possible. The pure intuition is this formal part. When it combines with sensation, it becomes empirical intuition, actual experience. Kant identifies space and time as two pure intuitions. Space is the form of outer sense, how we perceive external things. Time is the form of inner sense, how we perceive our inner experiences. Space and time are not learned from experience or created by thinking. Instead, they are inborn ways the mind structures all experience. Everything we perceive must appear in space and time, which is why we can only know things as they appear to us, not as they are in themselves. These appearances are called phenomena. Also, since external things are experienced by us in time as well as space, Time is actually the pure intuition of all phenomena. Finally, Kant explains that mathematics depends on these pure intuitions. Arithmetic is based on the intuition of time, because numbers follow one another. Geometry is based on the intuition of space, because we construct shapes through imagining spatial movement. This part of critique begins to answer Kant's big question, how is mathematics possible? But the full answer requires looking at the mind's a priori concepts, something that he addresses later in the Transcendental Analytic. Empirical intuitions by themselves do not yet constitute true knowledge. They are just collection of sensory data lacking the connection needed to form an object of knowledge. The mind's faculty that unifies this data into coherent objects is the intellect, which operates not by direct intuitions but through concepts, discursive representations that organize multiple perceptions under a common idea, giving them unity. The act by which concepts unify representations is called judgment. Thus, thinking always involves judging. The first part of Kant's Transcendental Analytic studies the a priori forms of the intellect, called analytic of concepts. The intellect's unifying function depends on pure concepts, concepts that exist prior to experience, which are necessary for any judgment. These pure concepts unify the manifold of empirical intuitions into a single object of knowledge. Kant calls these pure concepts categories, as they define the universal ways of thinking, just as Aristotle's categories define the universal modes of being. The number and character of Kant's categories correspond closely to the types of judgments found in traditional logic. Notably, in the category of relation, Kant includes substance and cause, concepts previously rejected by the empirists like Locke and Hume as metaphysical and illegitimate. Kant rehabilitates them, not as metaphysical realities, but as a priori forms essential for structuring experience and making scientific knowledge possible. Thus, phenomena can only be thought in terms of substance and cause, which are necessary mental forms. However, a problem arises. How can these pure, subjective intellectual forms produce knowledge that is universally valid and objective? For pure intuitions, space and time, this was clear due to their necessary and unique role, but categories could be potentially misused or applied incorrectly, threatening their validity. Kant answers this in the Transcendental Deduction of the Categories, one of the hardest chapters in the whole text. The term deduction in this case means justification. Kant argues that since every thought requires unifying intuitions, there must be an original unity underlying all acts of unification. This unity is found in the self-awareness of the subject, expressed as the I think, the transcendental apperception. The I think must accompany all representations for them to be thought at all, otherwise they would be impossible or not existing for the subject. Since this I think is identical in all thinking subjects, the unification it provides ensures universal and objective validity. The categories are just the internal logical functions of the I think, guiding the transcendental synthesis that makes knowledge possible. They are valid only when applied to empirical intuitions, the realm of experience. Applied beyond this realm, in pure thought without reference to experience, categories produce metaphysical errors and illusions. Because intuitions are only of phenomena, appearances, and never of the things in themselves, categories also apply only to the phenomenal world. The thing in itself remains unknowable, since it cannot be intuitively given or categorized. Even the thinking subject knows itself only as a phenomenon, appearing internally in time. The I think is the transcendental self-consciousness necessary for unity of experience, but is not knowledge of the self as an object. The non-phenomenal, or thing in itself, cannot be known but only thought as a limiting concept called noumenal, a negative idea that helps define the possibility of phenomena by contrast. As we've seen, the goal of the analytic of concepts is to break down the working of the intellect into its basic components, in order to identify its a priori forms, the pure concepts or categories. What remains to be explained is how these individual categories can actually be applied to sensory intuitions to produce judgments of experience, which are the foundation of our knowledge of nature. This is the focus of the second part of the Transcendental Analytic, the analytic of principles. Before examining these principles, we must first address a preliminary issue. In a transcendental deduction, Kant showed that applying categories to sensory intuitions is the only valid way to use them. However, this application is problematic because of the fundamental difference between categories, which are intellectual, and intuitions, which are sensory. This problem is addressed through transcendental schematism, whose purpose is to find a middle term that is capable both with the sensory nature of intuitions and the intellectual nature of categories. This middle term is provided by a faculty that stands between sense and understanding, combining features of both pure or productive imagination. Imagination is the result of the understanding acting on the senses, applying itself for the first time to possible objects of intuition. Like sensibility, imagination deals with intuitions, but like understanding, it can perform an initial synthesis of empirical data, an empirical synthesis, that prepares the way for the transcendental synthesis, a conceptual act of the understanding. Imagination allows us to not only perceive things in time, but to structure them within specific temporal frameworks, such as simultaneity or succession. This implies a basic level of connection. These determinations of time, according to rules, are called transcendental schemata. They act as a bridge between intuitions and categories. As temporal determinations, they relate to sensibility, since time is a pure form of intuition, and as a rule-based structures, they relate to the categories, which provide those rules. This leads to a clear correspondence between specific schemata and specific categories, or group of categories. For example, the schemata of permanence in time corresponds to the category of substance. The schemata of succession corresponds to the category of causality. The schemata of simultaneity corresponds to the category of reciprocal interaction. So, when imagination presents two phenomena as occurring in sequence, we must apply the category of causality, because the temporal succession is, in fact, a projection of the intellectual concept of causality onto the sensory field of time. Schemata are time determinations based on rules, and these rules are nothing other than the objective rules for using the categories. They are the fundamental criteria for any legitimate use of the understanding, being so general that they underline all knowledge, without themselves depending on anything higher. These rules are called the pure principles of the understanding, and they fall into four groups. Axioms of intuition. This state that all intuitions are extensive magnitudes, that is, everything we perceive in space and time has a quantitative form. We perceive them as measurable things. This justifies the use of mathematics in studying nature, for example, physics, the anticipations of perception. This hold that in all appearances, the real part that is sensed has an intensive quality, a degree. Every perception has a certain intensity. This intensity can be measured and predicted, which again allows the application of mathematics to the natural sciences. Analogies of experience. These are perhaps the most important, stating that experience is only possible through the representation of a necessary connection between perceptions. In other words, we only perceive a world of consistent laws. These necessary connections come in three forms: permanence, succession, and simultaneity, which align with the categories of substance, causality, and reciprocal interaction. The first analogy is the principle of the permanence of substance. Substance does not increase or decrease in nature. The second analogy is the principle of necessary causality. All phenomena occur according to law of cause and effect. And the third analogy, the principle of simultaneity under mutual interaction. All substances existing together in space interact with each other, allowing us to understand the universe as a web of mutual influences. And at the end, the postulates of empirical thought in general. These concern not the content of objects, but their status as possible, real, or necessary. An object is possible if it can exist in space and time, and fit within the categories. It is real if it corresponds to actual sensation. It is necessary if its reality follows from universal laws of experience. Kant identifies the pure principle of the understanding with the universal laws of nature, which in turn correspond to the principles of the Newtonian science. In this way, he solves a key problem of the critic. How is nature as unified, law-governed system possible? When seen as a totality of phenomena, naturae materialiter, nature is made possible by the laws of sensibility, how we perceive and organize sensations in space and time. But when viewed as a system of necessary connections, naturae formaliter, nature is made possible by the categories and pure principles of the understanding. The unity we find in nature is not something in the things themselves, which we cannot know in themselves, but the projections of the unity of our own mind, the transcendental unity of apperception, or the I think. Likewise, the laws we observe in the nature are not discovered in the objects, but rather imposed by the mind's a priori structure. This is the culmination of Kant's Copernican revolution. The lawful and unified structure of nature does not come from the object themselves, but from the subject. It is the subject who constitutes nature as a unified field of phenomena governed by necessary laws, which are nothing other than the fundamental rules of the understanding. Since the only legitimate use of categories is empirical, the sensible intuitions to which they apply also relate to limited portions of experience, that is, to a number of phenomena conditioned by specific space-time relations. In physics, for example, the laws imposed by the intellect on nature are valid only because they apply to phenomena that can actually be experienced by humans. However, Kant observes that human reason has a natural tendency to make a transcendent use of categories, going beyond the limits of possible experience. In this case, reason uses the categories, which are purely formal structures of thought and therefore unrelated to experience, in an extra-empirical and illegitimate way. More specifically, instead of applying categories to limited, conditioned phenomena, reason tries to form purely logical syntheses, creating concepts of unconditioned totalities, which, being limitless, cannot be derived from any actual experience. Kant believes that within humans there exists a faculty specifically inclined toward this mistaken yet natural tendency, reason in the strict sense. The concept of absolute totality that reason produces in this transcendent use of categories are called transcendental ideas. There are three possible kinds of absolute totalities, which correspond to three key ideas of reason: the idea of the soul, or the unconditioned unity of the thinking subject, the idea of the world, or the unconditioned totality of the phenomena in general, the idea of God, or the unconditioned unity of all objects of thought, seen as the ultimate foundation of reality. These three themes, soul, world, and God, are the core of traditional metaphysics, which, according to Wolff's classification, divides into rational psychology, soul, rational cosmology, world, and rational theology, God. Kant's critique of the transcendent use of ideas is therefore also a critique of metaphysics, whose attempt to know the essence of the soul, the world, and God arises from the illusion of extending the use of pure thought beyond the limits of experience. Nevertheless, Kant is aware that critical arguments in the Transcendental Dialectic cannot eliminate this metaphysical tendency from human nature. It is deeply rooted in our rational faculties. What philosophy can do, however, is uncover the logical mechanisms behind these illusions. Each transcendental idea suffers from a different kind of error, even if the common flaw is the lack of any possible connection to experience. The idea of the soul is based on a paralogism, a faulty argument that uses the word subject in two different senses to falsely deduce the soul's existence as a spiritual substance. In reality, the category of substance is wrongly applied to the I think, which is a formal function of the intellect, never given as an object in experience. The idea of the world leads to antinomies, pairs of contradictory statements, both of which seem logically valid. The world is entirely finite or infinite in space and time. It consists of ultimate elements or infinitely divisible. Everything is determined by natural laws or there is freedom. The world depends on a necessary being or everything is contingent. Each pair presents a contradiction only because the concept of world is taken as an object beyond experience, to which categories cannot validly apply. Kant distinguishes between mathematical antinomies, the first two, where both thesis and antithesis are false because they misapply space-time concepts to the whole world, and dynamical antinomies, the last two, where both sides can be true if applied to different levels of reality. The thesis refers to the things themselves, noumena, while the antithesis refers to phenomena. So, for example, freedom and a necessary cause may be possible beyond the realm of appearances, but this has no theoretical value. It simply expresses a possibility that reason cannot rule out. The idea of God has historically been supported by three types of proofs: ontological, or a priori. God's existence is implied by the concept of a perfect being. Cosmological, or a posteriori, the existence of contingent beings implies a necessary cause. Psychotheological, also a posteriori. The order and the purpose in nature point to a divine design. Kant critiques all three. The ontological proof fails because existence is not a predicate. It doesn't add anything to the concept of a being. The cosmological and psychotheological proofs depend on the ontological one, as they presuppose the idea of a most perfect being. Since ontological proof fails, so do the others. Still, Kant insists that transcendental ideas are not meaningless. On the contrary, they play an important regulative role. The idea of an unconditioned totality helps guide reason in organizing knowledge systematically, like seeing the whole image when assembling the piece of a mosaic. These ideas should not be used to constitute reality as categories do, but only in a regulative, heuristic way, to guide inquiry and systematization, never as source. These ideas should not be used to constitute reality as categories do, but only in a regulative, heuristic way, to guide inquiry and systematization, never as sources of actual knowledge. So, that was with the explanation of the critique of purism. I hope it was helpful. Thank you for watching this video. I'm Ivan and this is Empyrean, the Academy of Philosophy and Fine Arts.